Hannah, because I am passionate for these waters, you believe I have less regard for you. You see nature as brutal and unforgiving. This lake with the unpredictable spirit of an ocean is threatening. You wish me to choose, as if Georgian Bay were my mistress. I need you to understand. I feel alive here. This is the force that creates and takes all life. Most are blind to this. They see only the money and the opportunity. A grave misunderstanding. This is a place not to be conquered. Georgian Bay will see to it. Five Great Lakes share the border between Canada and the United States. 120 miles long, 50 miles wide, Georgian Bay is more than an extension of Lake Huron. Those who know it call it the sixth Great Lake. Georgian Bay is the creation of the last retreat of the Ice Age. The great hands of glaciers scraped and gouged out the tens of thousands of islands and shoals, leaving Georgian Bay a worn and rugged face, full of expression. This massive ridge of limestone called the Bruce Peninsula defines Georgian Bay. 300 million years ago, a tropical sea covered the area. Tiny shelled aquatic creatures and sediment sank to the ocean floor, eventually building this giant reef. An ancient ridge of limestone, so stubborn, even the Ice Age could not crush its great spine. Sheltered by the Bruce Peninsula, the southern shores are dense with trees and rimmed by gentle beaches. On the north shore, in the Killarney area, stand thinly treed hills, the remains of one of the world's oldest mountain ranges. Billions of years ago, this area towered as high as the Rocky Mountains. Up the eastern shore, the islands and shoals form a treacherous maze. Twisted by heat and pressure, they are quiet reminders of a time when the earth thundered with change, when molten magma spewed up from the depths and was cooled and crushed with immense force. Here, gnarled by the wind, the tenacious pine dared Georgian Bay's fury. But out in the open, the bay has claimed victory. We are the more recent additions to Georgian Bay's shores. Archaeological evidence shows human inhabitation by 9000 BC. Over time, many Indian nations interacted on Georgian Bay. They were each unique in their social, political, and religious organization. They developed into two linguistic families. To the north were the nomadic Algonquin-speaking peoples. They traded freely with their southern farming neighbors, the Iroquoian-speaking peoples, comprised of the Petun, Huron, and Iroquois. In 1615, the French explorer Samuel de Champlain journeyed to Georgian Bay. He described what he saw as La Mer Douce, the sweet water sea. Champlain began negotiations with the Indian nations, opening Georgian Bay to the Recollet missionaries and the fur trading monopolies from New France. As new alliances began forming, tensions between the Indian groups escalated and wars erupted. It took 50 years of upheaval before their lives gradually returned to normal. Europeans avoided the area, and for the next 100 years, Georgian Bay stood quiet and serene. Georgian Bay was an enigma to Europeans, as reflected in their curious maps, created purely from speculation and word of mouth. But it was not just the warring that kept them away. Shoals, lurking beneath the water's surface, filled them with dread. With the War of 1812, the British were determined to secure the Great Lakes from American domination. Most of the Algonquin allied themselves with the British to protect their homeland and peoples. Only following British victory did they fully understand their fate. The new boundaries opened Georgian Bay to European settlement. The first homes and businesses serviced the British Royal Navy at Penetanguishene around 1818. Over the next 175 years, a wave of laborers, farmers, cottagers, and dreamers rolled into Georgian Bay. This was a plentiful land with much to offer.
Our cottage has been in the family since my grandfather bought the island in the 1950s. Georgian Bay was the center of my summers for as long as I can remember. But even as a boy, I sensed something unusual about the bay. It began with the abandoned Copperhead Hotel on an island close to our cottage. I would pass by the Copperhead and peer into its dark windows, convinced that there were spirits staring back at me. The Copperhead story is like that of many of the bay's abandoned places. During the 20s and 30s, the hotel was one of the most popular in the area. Then, things began to change. With the introduction of phones, power, and refrigeration, the Copperhead was no longer the heart of the community. Years later, I visited the bay to find the Copperhead gone. Passing by, you would never know that a hotel once proudly stood here. I wondered about the spirits of the Copperhead Hotel and all the other displaced spirits from places long gone. This is a journey in search of those spirits. A journey to discover Georgian Bay's old ghost towns, shipwrecks, and history.
That's cool.
It has one of those that said don't leave it in the sun because it starts getting humidity. A celebration of those who are forgotten. Those who dared to make a life here in an unpredictable world. People from around the world are drawn to Georgian Bay. There are about 45,000 cottages in the area. People who summer here see it as their sanctuary.
The Boyds, one of the first cottaging families here, began summering on Georgian Bay in the 1880s. Theirs wasn't the era of the weekend commute. The Boyds ventured to Georgian Bay in June and stayed until Thanksgiving.
Our first trip up, we used a steam yacht, a sailboat, a scow, and a couple of canoes and rowboats to transport all our belongings. These included the furniture, supplies, and Millie, the cow.
After the boys settled everything in, the rest of us followed with the help. Our cooks, the maid, a handyman, laundress, and the nursemaid. After hearing the morning bell, my brothers tumbled out of their tents for a swim. Girls were only allowed to wash. You know, boys had everything better. We girls had to suffer through the heat donned in petticoats, corsets, stockings, boots, and hats.
The best part of the summer was our fancy dress ball. I hid my pirate costume in strict secrecy. At 9 o'clock, we proudly made our entrance. Everyone marched around the flagpole, then tucked into a cold buffet, all to the strains of the wind-up gramophone.
By the time the Boyds built their cottage in the 1880s, the hand of progress had already left its stark imprint. The logging boom was ushered in by the completion of the Northern Railroad from Toronto to Georgian Bay in 1855. The train linked the bay to the world. The desire for wood was insatiable. Both North America and Britain were in a building frenzy. People came here with dreams of prosperity. Now, all that remain are a few abandoned monuments.
The village of Collins Inlet was located on the North Shore. It was a typical logging community centered around its mill. Little remains but these posts from a delivery dock.
The mill was just a small thing. Then it expanded in 1886 when John Bertram came. Under him, a whole town sprang up around the 100-foot sawdust burner. Everything was shipped from the main dock. We used to play hide and seek there in between the big piles of cut lumber. Even better were the fish packing crates. You could hide right under them. The dock was the center of town. We used to run down when the ship came in with the supplies and mail. Mother always said getting a letter made her feel a part of the rest of the world.
In 1912, the mill was destroyed by fire, and the town was eventually abandoned. But a lone reminder still stands on a hill. This empty house is testimony to the village of Collins Inlet. But dilapidated rooms tell few stories of life in this mill town. They don't tell of the lumber industry, its magnitude, its fever. Many similar mills on Georgian Bay roared 24 hours a day to service the unending demand for cut timber. Georgian Bay was said to be the second only to the Ottawa Valley for virgin white pine. Lumber camps sprang up everywhere, attracting workers from both the country and the city. In spite of their codes of honesty and generosity, Canadian lumberjacks were notorious for their lack of bathing and couth.
Home was where you were. We built shanty camps for as long as the trees lasted, and then we moved on and rebuilt the whole works.
A shanty was a simple log cabin, lined with bunk beds made of logs. At 8 o'clock, we piled into the beds. No need to undress. Just take off the old boots to keep the feet a-blazing by the night fire.
It was a kind of scurvy. We called it the Black Leg. That's what you get from months of eating only salt pork sandwiches, smothered in corn syrup.
Oh, yes, when the whiskey flowed, drunken tempers broke into brawls. He's got lumberman's smallpox, was the joke when we saw a man wearing the spiked imprint of another man's boot on his face.
Over the winter, logs were dragged from the woods and piled onto the ice. During the spring melt, an army of river drivers, secured only by their caulked boots, herded the logs into the open water of the bay. Logs were placed in huge bag booms and then towed to their destination. One bag boom could be as wide as 25 acres. They collided with everything from buoys to steamers. During these early years, the disappearing forest was a celebrated march toward progress. But nature responded to the assault. As the trees vanished, rivers dried up, and birds disappeared. Milled bark and sawdust dumped into the water killed fish and destroyed spawning sites. We stood by our spoils, only generations later, realizing what was lost.
Situated at the mouth of the French River Village was among the larger mill towns on Georgian Bay.
Okay, oh, I see. So you're looking at this point right here as being this right.
We use old photographs to help us establish where French River Village once stood.
It's sort of shooting this way a bit. I think this guy shot it from up there, frankly. Right up there? Yeah.
Yeah. Line right across. So we need to be. We gotta.
It's actually right up by that poplar tree up the top.
Yeah,
by the
that one.
juniper bush.
We stand up there.
There's a little. I don't want to go.
It is hard to believe that a community of 1,000 people once sprawled on both sides of this river.
When the saleable timber was gone, the mill was closed. Without it, residents had little purpose in staying. The barren rock and isolation quickly overcame French River Village. It was a ghost town by the 1920s. The foundation of the mill is one of the only remnants of French River Village. In 1875, a distinguished traveler, Cleveland Hamilton, passed through town.
I found the French River a great lumber center with 2 mills, immense piles of pine boards and long elevated tramways for the moving and hauling of lumber. The Queen's Hotel boasted fine wines and cigars of the best quality, and a visit to the barber and a good game of billiards almost equaled the exquisite fishing and hunting.
We move further into the bush, determined to discover the exact locations of some of the former buildings. In what was the center of town, we find no clues. We know villagers built staircases from the sawdust roads up to their homes. The hills that surround us indicate we're in the right area.
Families grew up here. Personal histories were made. But since French River Village had only the one purpose, when the trees were gone, its fate was sealed. The village was only one episode in French River's magnificent history. An earlier episode began in 1610, when Champlain convinced a Huron tribe to take his 18-year-old aide, Etienne Brulé, to Georgian Bay so that he could learn of their land and customs. Brulé canoed through this passage, the first European to see these shores. The river soon became the major fur trading route, linking Quebec to the rich interior. For centuries, natives and fur traders commanded Georgian Bay's waters in lightweight and easily mendable birch bark canoes. Then, with the War of 1812, schooners like the Mink and the Nancy were introduced to the bay. With European settlement, these larger boats were joined by smaller pleasure craft. By the 1860s, the most popular of these became the locally designed double-masted Mackinaw. Boats were the lifeline of the community. Not even the cash-sparse 1930s could thwart the enthusiasm. This ingenious iceboat was created from a bed frame, blankets, and a birch tree mast. Ship manufacturing developed into a lucrative industry. People prospered, and towns grew. But schooners fell into disuse in the 1890s when steamships expanded their routes to connect with the growing railway system. They plied their remaining days as workhorses burdened with lumber and other undesirable cargo. Steamships brought security. Now, even the most isolated communities were promised reliable delivery of mail and supplies. With expanding rail and dock facilities, Georgian Bay was linked to the world markets. Passenger steamships heralded a colorful time. They brought communities together and enticed visitors to the bay. But the waters weren't always kind. We naively believed that Georgian Bay was passive and that her resources were there for the taking. Our first mistake. Georgian Bay proved to be brutal and unrelenting, fluid in her changing moods. To survive these waters meant treating her with fear and respect. They all knew that Georgian Bay's geographical position made for her quick temper. Winds sweeping from Lake Huron could build and strike the eastern shores with violent force. They had come against a lake with the raging spirit of an ocean. once busily plied their trade are now skeletons in the shadowy underworld. Hundreds have been discovered, but many more are anonymous and forgotten. Of all the dark events that marred the record of passenger service, the mysterious loss of the Wabano remains the most chilling. A 120-foot sidewheeler, she blazed her route from Collingwood to Parry Sound. November 21st, 1879, she was moored due to a storm. Many of her anxious passengers left for accommodation in the town of Collingwood. But a few decided to stay the night on board. All was well until a rumor nervously spread. It seemed the newlywed Mrs. Dupe was frantic over a dream in which she saw the Wabano and its passengers perish in Georgian Bay's wild fury.
I don't want to stay on board tonight.
We're safely anchored. We're not going anywhere. For heaven's sake, Elizabeth. It was just a dream.
But it felt so real. Saw the Wabano being crushed in a storm. People being swallowed into the blackness.
At 4 a.m., a number of passengers in town were awakened by the haunting sound of a ship's whistle. Peering out into the stormy night, they were horrified by what they saw. The Wabano making its way into treacherous open water. Around noon, 2 loggers at Moon River heard the Wabano's distress signal. Why did the captain leave Collingwood in such haste? Why would he jeopardize the lives of those on board? These questions are still unanswered. Here, where the Haystack Islands stand like tombstones, it is believed the Wabano's body was snapped in two. The passenger deck ripped off and tossed into the deep. The following day, a search crew found only drifting debris and smashed fragments of the Dupe's furniture. Every life jacket was eventually found. But as for the dead, they remained property of the bay.
The Wabano's hull, torn from its passenger deck, drifted almost a mile before coming to rest here, in a cove off Wreck Island.
It was just a dream.
But it felt so real.
Over the years, the only significant articles retrieved include her windlass, the safe, an anchor, and her broken rudder. The passenger deck and the dead were never discovered. Christian Island was among the many islands the Wabeno passed on its route. On its southern tip stands a lighthouse built in 1854. From this view, the keeper saw the Wabeno on its final journey. But Christian Island's history begins long before this lighthouse and the story of the Wabeno. Christian Island's past is linked to a much bigger tragedy.
In the early 1600s, Champlain influenced the growing struggle for power when he assisted the Hurons in the battle against their enemies, the Iroquois. But what did the French hope to gain here? Behind their desire to control the fur trade and to spread Christianity was the goal of creating an entirely new French Catholic society. By 1647, the fighting between the Huron and Iroquois had escalated dramatically. As the Iroquois gained the upper hand, the Hurons were forced to choose between leaving Georgian Bay, joining other Indian groups, or staying to face an increasingly desperate situation. A local missionary, Jean de Brébeuf, dreamt of a blood-red cross hovering over Iroquois territory. He confided, "It was large enough to crucify us all." Unaware, Brébeuf had had a vision of his tragic destiny. When 1,000 Iroquois launched a bloody siege on the Huron mission of Saint Ignace, only 3 of the 400 Hurons inside survived. These 3 ran to a neighboring community, Saint Louis, to warn others of an imminent Iroquois attack. At this mission, 80 Huron and the Jesuits, Brébeuf and Gabriel Lallemant, refused to flee. The Hurons fought valiantly at Saint Louis for an entire day before the Iroquois overran their defenses. Those that died in battle were fortunate. Many of the survivors, including Lallemant and Brébeuf, were brutally put to death. Those who escaped Saint Louis sought protection at the next mission, Fort Sainte-Marie. But Fort Sainte-Marie provided only a temporary refuge. Most of the people inside decided to flee. As they left, they burned the mission to the ground. By now, 3,000 Hurons, supported by several Jesuits, had grouped. Refusing to be pushed out by the Iroquois, they sought refuge here on Christian Island. However, not even this provided sanctuary. The Iroquois killed any Huron who dared venture off the island to fish or hunt. The Hurons slowly starved. By the 10th of June, 1650, only 300 of the 3,000 Hurons had survived Christian Island. These 300 paddled from their homeland to New France, beginning a new chapter in their history. Tales of brutality have superseded a more enduring legacy of the Iroquoian peoples, their complex political and social organization. The Confederation of Five Nations was deemed so sophisticated, it inspired and influenced many great thinkers, like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Friedrich Engels, Karl Marx, and Benjamin Franklin, co-author of the American Constitution. And so remains Christian Island, one piece of a historic puzzle, one fragment of time. We call Georgian Bay the 30,000 islands, 30,000 fragments of time. Islands. Islands for burial, islands of legend, islands as home.
Our interest in ghost towns has moved from the shore-locked mill towns to the rugged fishing villages out on the open bay. We spend the evening reading John Hillis's letters, an intimate recollection of fishing life in these isolated communities.
Okay. He talks about Squaw Island. Where's Squaw Island on here? Is it on this map? He said there were hundreds of people on Squaw Island in the summer, kids and all.
There were hundreds of people on Squaw Island in the summer, kids and all. From the fish company, we used to get $5 a month. Now that's if we stayed all season. But in the fall, you ended up with nothing because you owed it all to the company store. Fishermen were busy people, tarring, mending, drying linen nets. And you know, we were up at the crack of dawn. In the afternoon, you had to catch the off-land breeze. It started around 3 or 4. And if you didn't catch it, you'd be rowing yourself back in. Fish were saved by salting, freezing or drying. The bigger stations had their fish picked up by schooner to be delivered by train. I remember seeing frozen fish stacked up like cordwood and a sign reading, "Take your pick for 25 cents. That was at Cape Rich. There were a lot of big stories too. Oh yeah. Like the fella that bought the suit, a gallon of whiskey and a cow no less, for selling 1 sturgeon. Mind you, it was a big fish. There were so many fishing stations on the bay. Some are gone now, and some are just abandoned. In 1901, 26 families made their living on Fitzwilliam Island, from early April to mid-August. Far away from civilized amenities, their entire world was Georgian Bay. Abandoned 60 years ago, this fishing station will soon be at one with the peaceful surroundings.
Across the bay from Fitzwilliam Island is a cluster of islands and shoals called the Minks. The islands were once home to an enterprising fishing station, but now they stand quiet. The smooth granite of the Minks contrasts sharply with the wooded Fitzwilliam Island. They seem a calm oasis from the blustery weather of the open bay.
An echo of early fishing life on the Minks can be found in the 1896 journal of a traveler enchanted by this place.
A huge supper was spread in a shanty. A visiting fiddler made music, and shoes not the lightest beat the floor, not the smoothest. Little ones dozed in the arms of their smiling mothers. Sitting on hard benches, the rugged features on the men relaxed. This was a strange contrast as we passed through the open door. Waves splashed and sparkled in the moonlight. Orion was in the east. The northern lights flashed and danced to and fro in the northwest.
They danced away that evening in 1896 in the peaceful shroud of a Georgian Bay summer night.
We now travel north of the Minks. Our continuing search for old fishing stations leads us to the Bustard Islands. Windblown and unsheltered, the Bustards seem a harsh location for Georgian Bay's second largest fishing station. But the Bustards were home to 36 families during the season. Brian Drever's family has fished here for generations. He describes the ice harvest.
Come out here, 2 teams of horses, bring out about...
But how would they cut the ice physically?
Oh, just with hand saws. They just chop a hole and then start sawing from there. Saw their fields, and they take the ice, hook onto tongs, and the lower ones they just slide in, and they had big wooden slides. They bring the blocks, 300 to 400 pound blocks up, and the horses pull them up the skids, and then they cover the whole horse with sawdust.
Why would they have to crush it in this?
Well, this is when you're going to pack your fish. Big spikes in there, and as you come around, just chop the dickens right out of it.
The ice house is on the point here?
The ice house was right in this area here. This was all ice house, and the slides were coming up into here. They filled it from that end because of the access to the lake. Rather than come over the dock, they filled it up through here.
Out on the boat, Brian describes the search for the lost fishing station on the Bustard Islands that dates back to the 1870s.
We couldn't find a darn thing in there at all. No nails, no old cribs. No, we figured to be, the remnants of an old crib or something, but we found absolutely nothing in there. So...
What do you think the building in the photograph was?
I'd imagine that would be their ice house.
Where there were no spikes in the water.
Yeah, but you think they had wooden docks, there'd be cribs, there'd be long spikes in them, unless, like they say, they could be in the silt in the bottom or anything by now. But the buildings itself up on the hill, we thought we'd find something, to show where they had been, but we couldn't find a rusty nail or anything up there, so I really don't know. But this is the only place it could have been.
Fishing stations like this one on the Bustards live on through photographs, but many of the single-family camps were never recorded and have long been forgotten. When the fish stocks declined in the 1930s, most of the families gave up on the industry. Only a small number still retain commercial fishing licenses to this day. The diminished stocks are a complex result of the introduction of aggressive foreign species like the sea lamprey, sawdust pollution from the lumber industry, and overfishing.
Around fishing stations, I find the lake bottom littered with items, the only tangible evidence of the fishermen and their families. Georgian Bay is renowned for being territorial over her spoils. The loss of the steamer, the Jane Miller, is the eeriest example of how the bay hides her possessions. The Jane Miller is Georgian Bay's only ghost ship.
She was a modest 78-foot steamer that transported goods and people up and down the Bruce Peninsula. During a heavy storm in 1880, Mr. Cameron and his son watched nervously.
Father, look!
I think that's the Jane Miller.
It disappeared.
I can't see a thing. It's out there. We just saw it.
The following day, the village of Wyerton was paralyzed. The Jane Miller, with her 28 passengers, was long overdue. Three men went out to look for the telltale debris.
If Cameron were right, she could be sunk anywhere in a mile around here.
Look, over there.
What do you make of that?
I believe, my friends, we found the Jane Miller.
The men had witnessed a spot of water that was seething, bubbling, and peculiarly discolored. This spot lined up with the Camerons' house. Later, in a cove on White Cloud Island, an oar and 5 caps were found and confirmed to be from the Jane Miller. Many times, without success, people from the community dragged the lake bottom. In spite of the witnesses to her sinking, the wreck could not be found. Then there was a strange reoccurrence. One dark night, sitting by a campfire, a group of hunters were convinced they heard cries for help. The following morning, the hunters passed by an oddly colored patch of water bubbling up from the depths. Only it was over 20 years after the disappearance of the Jane Miller. Where is the Jane Miller? Perhaps wedged in a deep chasm, a dark place where the bay's floor meets the Bruce Peninsula. A vast underworld where ghosts are held captive by the weight of silence.
Georgian Bay's best-known ghost is on Cove Island, located off the tip of the Bruce Peninsula.
The story goes that the crew of the Regina mutinied shortly before the schooner was overcome by a storm. The captain went down with his vessel off Cove Island. His presence has often been felt here. When one lighthouse keeper was unable to tend the light for a number of days, the kerosene lamps were mysteriously lit, and the lighthouse continued operation uninterrupted.
Jack Vaughn, the last lighthouse keeper on Cove Island before its automation.
He found this captain, his name is Captain Tripp, and he was supposed to roll him up in the sail of the sailboat, and he's buried over there in the sand someplace. Nobody knows where. And like you used to hear banging doors around here, you used to say, well, there's Captain Tripp around. They always, that was a ghost of Cove Island. So that's that.
Oh, this is old.
Yeah. This house was built in 1854, the same as the lighthouse.
So they just kept it here?
Yeah, I was the last one to live in it, yeah. You can go upstairs and see how shallow the ceilings are up there. And this here is mercury in here. That's mercury in there.
Keep the ground.
And see, here's the original foghorn back in 1854.
This is the original foghorn?
That's the original.
Does it go? How much limestone went into constructing this?
Down the bottom, right when you come in through the door, they're around 7 feet. And And then by the time you get to the top, they run down about 2.5 feet. And then they use it for the whitewash too.
So it's all limestone in here.
Yeah.
It's not actually painted.
No, because that's a mercury. The original one was an arc. And that was a duller light. You could see it further. And before that, it was kerosene.
So that would have been a lot of work for the lighthouse keeper, always having to keep the kerosene lit at all times.
Well, yeah, and then you had that's why those doors are down there, to keep the draft from coming up. If the draft come up and get the lamp smoking, this place would be nothing but a bunch of cobwebs and black smoke, and that's why everything is painted here. This is all brass. Back when you used to turn the light off at sunrise, you drop these curtains that kept the sun from coming in onto the magnifying glass. Otherwise, it'd start a fire in the bush.
When lighthouse keepers lived on remote islands like the Westerns, they were often the only witness to a ship's last and fatal journey. Of these unfortunate tales, the story of the Asia remains the most devastating.
It was the largest cargo hold of that year. The Asia was overloaded with winter supplies and 122 passengers. Christy Ann Morrison was uneasy traveling alone, but was comforted by knowing her cousin was the first mate. When the weather started turning, she spied the crew frantically tossing cargo and animals off the upper deck. Christy Ann knew they were in danger. The ship began to sway. Duncan Tinkus also witnessed the horrifying events.
The Asia vanished between two monster waves and began to list. We rushed on deck. People were screaming and running around. No one knew what to do or where to go. With every wave that pounded, the ship twisted a little more and slowly rolled over.
I was on deck. Then I don't know if I jumped or if the hurricane pulled me in, but by a miracle of God, I saw my cousin and other men in the lifeboat. They managed to pull me in. Then Duncan swam up and pleaded with us to take him. By now, the ship was sinking.
Waves kept tossing us out of the boat. After a while, people didn't cry out anymore.
It got calmer. So the remaining 7 of us climbed into the lifeboat. There were 2 lumbermen. Oh, and then there was Mr. Little. Poor Mr. Little. And my cousin at the bow of the boat, he was trying to be so brave. Oh, I was glad he was there. The captain, he looked horribly ill. And then Duncan was just trying to hold on. But finally the storm passed. Drifted and drifted. Then suddenly we saw an island in the distance. But we were moving so slowly. To lift our spirits, we began to sing.
The drifting seemed endless. And then suddenly the wind changed direction, and we headed back out to open water. We were so cold and exhausted that it was too much.
I just all gave up. One by one, the men died. Then it was just me and Duncan and the waves.
The 2 17-year-olds drifted with their grisly cargo until they landed on an island. They slept that night on the shore and were found the following day by 2 locals. 3 days from the time the Asia had left port, Christy Ann and Duncan arrived in Parry Sound, the only survivors out of 122 passengers. Christy Ann Morrison posing as the heroine of the disaster. She and Duncan met twice later in life, and it is known they never discussed the horror of that September of 1882. Few of the bodies were ever recovered, and the Asia's final resting place, like the Wabanos and the Jane Millers, will remain the bay's guarded secret.
We have passed Parry Sound, one of the older towns on Georgian Bay, and the place where Christy Ann was taken after the Asia disaster. But we are interested in its connection to the nearby ghost town of Depot Harbor.
J.R. Booth was a Canadian entrepreneur. He was a man filled with contradiction. He openly defied the Factory Act, which forbade the hiring of children, and yet he was known to anonymously supply food and fuel to employees who fell ill or were injured. Booth was a powerful man. He owned the largest timber limits in Canada, and in 1879 began expanding into the railroad business. Parry Sound had a fine port, but to attract the big cargo ships, it had to build a link to the already thriving rail network. Booth seduced the town with a promise to make Parry Sound the rail terminus for the Atlantic. A fantastic proposition that went sour. He needed land to build the railway, and the Parry Sound landowners were holding out for ridiculous prices. Enraged, Booth announced to the local paper that the deal was dead. Many speculated that Booth used the land prices as an excuse. He never intended to build in Parry Sound, but used the early partnership to access government subsidies. A shrewd man, he surely hadn't missed the best natural harbor on the Great Lakes, just a stone's throw away from Parry Sound on Parry Island. Just one problem. Parry Island was owned by the Ojibwa. Booth wasn't concerned. He announced to the local paper that beyond any doubt, the terminus for the Atlantic would be on Parry Island. The residents were furious and were determined not to lose their land. But Booth knew the twists of the law. Officials used an 1887 amendment of the Indian Act that allowed for the appropriation of native land for rail purposes. The Ojibwa were forced to sell their land for $9 an acre. By 1899, Parry Sound had a rival boom town on Parry Island called Depot Harbor.
I'm telling you, it was like an explosion. From nothing to 12 city blocks, 103 family homes, those for the management and those for the workers. We had a 3-story bunkhouse for men and 3 churches, 2 grain elevators, and a roundhouse for 10 locomotives. We got ourselves 11 ethnic groups here, and a population of 650 that balloons to 3,000 during the summer. There's a buzz from the 50 or 60 ships that come to the depot's port.
Booth's dream began to fade with the Great Depression of the 1930s. His railroad was in distress and was bought out by the Grand Trunk. During the Second World War, the rarely used elevators were filled with highly explosive cordite. In 1945, an elevator caught fire. Sheets of flame exploded into the sky. The intense heat was enough to melt steel and bend train tracks. Over the years, businesses tried and failed in Depot Harbor. The town was eventually abandoned. Buildings were sold for a pittance and torn down. In 1987, the Ojibwa of Parry Island broke the Canadian National Railway's 99-year lease and reclaimed their land. This map from 1822 is the first complete rendering of Georgian Bay. The survey, which took a grueling 4 years, was headed by Admiral Bayfield. Bayfield's map is more than a victory over this maze of rocks and shoals, more than a physical blueprint. It is a record of past events. Lottie Wolf Rock marks where the schooner met her untimely fate. Present Island, where the British government gave annual offerings of gifts to the native peoples. Dead Island, an old Ojibwa burial island, a place of community, holy ground. Placed under stones or in trees, the dead faced the west, supplied with tobacco, trinkets, kettles, and weapons to aid in their journey into the afterlife. Until 1896, when a ship came in search of items for the Chicago World's Fair. The island was stripped of bodies and precious items to sate the fascination of the civilized world. Other names reflect distinguishing characteristics and the grandeur of nature. The natural monuments on Flowerpot Island guard Georgian Bay's entrance from Lake Huron. Giant's Tomb Island, where Kitchikawana, exhausted from creating the 30,000 islands of Georgian Bay, laid down and died. Giant's Tomb Island reveals the shape of his great figure. The limestone islands seem unassuming, but they hold records of life dating back 450 million years. These are the fossilized remains of creatures that died and fell to the floor of a tropical sea, which once stood near the equator. In every crevice of this great lake is a moment of history slowly drifting into extinction. Memory reemerges as folklore and myth, binding reality and imagination.
Generations have made a life on Georgian Bay's shores and islands, leaving us a part of themselves.
"30,000 islands, 30,000 stories, 30,000 memories." James Henson, born on a plantation near Baltimore, escaped slavery through the Underground Railway to Georgian Bay. Billy Bishop, Canada's greatest flying ace, was born on Georgian Bay's southern shores. Nanny Bawakwa traveled to England in 1860 to petition Queen Victoria for native land rights on Georgian Bay. Promises were made, but none were kept. Their experiences are part of this place. Their spirits are in the rhythms of this lake. I hear them stirring in the clouds. Echoey voices, muted by the sound of the waves. We bring life to this world, but in time, the circle is made complete. Our souls drift on the wind. What other existence is there for a forgotten past? For they are our ghosts, the ghosts of the bay.